Awesome. Thank you, Eileen. And again, welcome everyone. Good to see so many of you. We'll virtually see you anyway. Welcome to our second webinar for our New York Psychiatric Rehabilitation Training Academy, working with diverse populations, paying attention to implicit bias, anti-racism, and anti-oppressive practices, and racialized trauma. My name is Daniela Labate-Cavelli. I'm so excited to see all of you here with us today. We had a wonderful turnout for our first webinar and our first office hour. We're hoping to continue the momentum today. We have an incredible topic with some wonderful presenters that I think will really sort of set the stage for us. And then you'll be able to kind of take that information and really link it to the work that you're doing, the psych rehab work that you're doing. So real quick housekeeping stuff, and then I'm going to turn it over. You see our training partner page, always want to give them a shout out. They're our partners in this project, and you'll see today that Lenora and Marie are from CCSI, Coordinated Care Services, one of our partners as well. So I want to get into the real nitty gritty of the housekeeping. So this is the important stuff. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will find the slides as well as the recording on our website, www.psychrehabacademy.org. It'll be living in the archived training page. So you'll have access to the webinar recording as well as the PowerPoint. We have 1.5 continuing education hours approved for LMSWs, LCSWs, CPRPs, LMHCs, KSACs, LCATs, and MFTs. We have applied for CEs for SERPAs and other peer recovery support professionals, as well as New York State certified peer specialists. We have not yet received approval for those two credentials yet. If you are seeking any of those continuing education credits, we need you to fill out the evaluation. And when you do fill out that evaluation, check the box for the continuing ed credit you are seeking. We want everyone to fill out the evaluation. It's actually super important that you fill out the evaluation because that's how we account and accrue your CPRP hours. So you've got to watch the entire webinar if you're watching this recorded, and you've got to listen in and be with us for the entire webinar if you're watching live in order to get that continuing ed credit. What else? Oh, so the chat box. So you're all very familiar with the chat box, I see, because it is literally in the 5 seconds I've been writing, like 45 messages have popped up already. So please continue to use the chat box. We want you to communicate with us using the chat. We also have a couple of cool things like word clouds and poll questions that we're going to ask you to work with us on. But if you have any questions for our presenters, use the chat box, chat it into everyone so that we can all see your questions. We'll be keeping track of that throughout. And then at the end, Marie and Lenora will be answering your questions. Any questions that we don't get to today, we're going to hold and bring them up next week when Marie and Lenora are with us for the office hour. The information you receive is accurate as of today's date. That's always my disclaimer, because in case you're watching this, a year from now, who knows when you'll be watching this, we want to make sure that we say that. And the other thing I want to remind people about is the keywords. So keywords are super important. You'll be hearing 3 keywords, one at the beginning, one at the middle, and one at the end. Please write those keywords down somewhere on a pad on your desk. You don't need to put them into the chat box, but you should hold on to them somewhere because you're going to be asked about those keywords for the evaluation. Okay, so I want to introduce our presenters now. We have with us Lenora Reid-Rose and Marie Gillum. I'm going to read your bios because I know you very well, but I want to make sure I get it all right. So Lenora Reid-Rose is the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives, Partnerships, and Community Connectedness at Coordinated Care Services, Inc., or CCSI. She brings more than 20 years of experience in the field of behavioral health, and she served as a consultant and educator in the regional, state, and national levels. Lenora is passionate about supporting organizations to strengthen practices focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. She served as a subject matter expert who consults on special projects focused on DEI and anti-racist practices, and was awarded the Rochester Business Journal 2020 Icon Award for her notable successes and strong leadership in the field. So we're so lucky to have you with us, Lenora, and we're also very lucky to have you Marie with us. So a little bit about Marie. Marie Gillum is the Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consultant with CCSI. Within her role, she works alongside organizations as they actively aim to incorporate philosophies that highlight the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion within their organizational structures. Marie has experience facilitating DEI workshops, dialogues, and presentations within the local Rochester, New York community. Her varied experiences include diversity recruitment and retention, as well as experience leading and facilitating programs that foster inclusion and belonging of employees of diverse backgrounds. So with that, I want to say welcome to both of you, Lenora and Marie. We're so lucky to have you, not only as our partners, but as our friends at NIAPers. So we're really excited to be working on this with you. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Lenora.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And I'm going to echo your welcome. Just thanking folks for being interested in the topic, but also the willingness to share with us, to be with us for 1.5 hours. We are super excited to be a part of this exciting journey that New York State has kind of entrusted NIAPers to take us on. And one of the things that we always want to put out there, that as much as we are the presenters, we don't know it all. We don't expect to know it all. We will never have enough brain cells to really, truly absorb and retain everything that's there. And we want you to feel free to interrupt us in the chat and says, okay, pause a minute, what's going on here? It doesn't make sense. Can I get some more clarification? We will be going very fast because, as usual, we prepare more slides than we need to. And as much as we've cut back on the slides, we've cut back. I still think we have more than enough. So do expect some unfinished business. So for today, I'm sure that most of you on this call, if not all, have heard the word institutional structural racism. You've heard about racial equity and equitable health outcomes. You've heard about implicit bias. You've heard about discrimination, stereotypes, oppressive behaviors, and all these things, I kind of call them things, that kind of interfere with us as staff and interfere with our participants from really getting to the outcomes that they so deserve. And, you know, we're going to be probably interchangeable. I know sometimes we use the word consumers, we use the word clients, we use the word participants, we use the word members. I'm not sure what the preferred word for this webinar is because I'm sure you're all in different places. So please bear with us that we're talking about the same thing, and let's not get hung up on the word. So those are some of the gems, those are some of the terms that we will be weaving throughout the organization. So throughout our presentation, sorry. So this presentation is not going to be, this is what racism is, this is what implicit biases, this is what this is. We did I think it was an 80-slide presentation or so, and it will be, or should be by now, on the NIAPers, the website, where you guys can at your leisure kind of go there and get a little bit more in-depth information on what those things are. We will interject the words as we go through, and you'll get a chance to see the connection. We will explore relationships between these terms: implicit bias, racialized trauma, anti-racism. We'll try to share some strategies and some resources with you, and probably get one of the things that we really want to focus on today, or we will be focusing on, is some of the deeper conversations that sometimes you don't hear. What is at the root of some of this? It's not enough to say it's race, it's ethnicity. We really want people to begin to broaden their sphere. We wanted to kind of get out of the box a little bit. I'm one of those, sometimes I tend to stick in the box, and by staying in my box, I lose out on a lot of opportunities to actually learn more. So our objectives, to get some shared language around some of the terms that we're going to be using, to understand and recognize the impact of implicit bias, where it's coming from, what's driving it, to develop increased awareness surrounding individual behaviors, organizational policies, what that means, where it's coming from, and what's really driving some of that, and how it really perpetuates a lot of our policies, a lot of our procedures, a lot of things that we grow up with. And I say grow up as professionals or in our places, they perpetuate some of the very things that we're trying to get rid of. And as one of those individuals that is constantly learning, I know in some of my work, I've perpetuated some of the same things that even in that same webinar, I'm trying to get rid of or to address. It's not an easy thing. And we're not going to sit up here in our wonderful comfy chairs at CCSI and let you figure it's easy. It's a challenge because we all went to the same school. We drank the same Kool-Aid. And sometimes the things that we want to address were not addressed at that time. So now we have to kind of backpedal and address some of the stuff that we need to address so that we can kind of break down the walls of disparities, if not eliminate them, but at least reduce the impact of it. Some disclaimers. This is not a clinical training. We will not get into clinical practices, concepts, or processes. Sometimes I think I could be a clinician and I may act like one, but really it is not. I will try to keep that hat on today and not unleash that hat, because it really is not a clinical training. You will not be culturally competent at the end of this training, and you should not expect to be after an hour and a half. There will be a lot of unfinished business, and we expect you to continue to learning. There are lots of resources out there that you can further your understanding of what we're talking about. We will be at times expressing our personal truth. That's who we are. That's who we are as individuals. And very often we intersperse what we know. We intersperse ourselves into it to give a better understanding of what we're talking about. And the service population, sometimes we refer as participants. It could be clients, it could be members. And we may use some common language that you may be aware of as well as you may not be aware of, but that's kind of some of the things that you may will be going through today. Working agreements and norms. We would love for you to listen and observe for understanding. Feel free to ask clarifying questions. Step up and step back. This is kind of one of the important things. You step up, you say your piece, you don't sit in that space. You step back so others can step up. So sometimes, you know, we want to just hog the place. We're saying you step in there, then you kind of move out a little bit, because like Daniela said earlier, we have close to 400 people. And can you imagine if you just hog the space, you're not giving that opportunity for others. Assume that they're good intentions. We're going to ask you to do that in this hour and a half. Be comfortable with unfinished conversations. Confidentiality is key. So sometimes you may hear people express stuff or share stuff between us for this hour and a half. Please let it stay right there. If you want to share it, please get the person's permission to do so. Speaks from self, don't speak from anybody else. And you know, challenge gentle. I don't mind a gentle challenge or a little nod or a little kick sometimes. So feel free to do that, because as I said earlier, we are not the only experts. There's so much that we don't know. And I'll tell you that every time I prepare for one of these presentations, I learn so much more. And every time I engage with an audience like you, I learned so much, so much. I don't know probably half the things I need to. I just happen to be in that position where I can help to facilitate a conversation. We're going to pause every now and then to give you an opportunity to ask questions if you want to, but also we're monitoring the chat. So if you have some ever question you want to just blurt out there, throw it right in the chat and we will respond to it. Both Marie and I will respond to it. So now 2-second pause. Any questions? Anything? Do I just run with it? 1 hippopotamus, 2 hippopotamus, 3 hippopotamus, 3 seconds. I'm just gonna run with it.
All right.
So one things I want us to begin with, let's begin with the why. You know, it's very often we do not stop to ask the why. And I'd like you to think about the why, because the why helps us to unravel the different layers. Why is the New York State Office of Mental Health investing in this training initiative? I want you guys to think about it. Why do you think they're putting so many resources behind it? Why are you here? Why? So share with us some of your responses in the chat. So I see professional growth. I see it could just be to be able to ride the purple donkey or the purple horse. That may be one of New York State's reason. Why is it to help further connect with recovery practices? It's an important recovery tool. We serve a diverse population and we need to know to better. Oh, this is going so fast.
Going fast, Miss Lenora.
Yes, it's going fast. Oh my God, I didn't practice my speed reading. Growth, inclusion of all people, to meet clients where they're at, to improve, to better assist, to have competent professionals, to work better with the population, need for incorporating this knowledge into daily practice, taking into account the experiences of the population we serve, growth. OMH wants staff to learn so that we can help the people we serve, and that's perfect. Those are some very, very great response to care for our fellow human beings. Those are great response. I'm going to put something else out there that I think OMH is investing in this training, this core training, and put in resources, not just financial, but people behind it because of the disparities in outcomes. I'm going to pause for 1 hippopotamus, 2 hippopotamus, 3 seconds, let's go. So they really want to look on how can we address, for some of those same reasons that you listed, how can we address the disparities in outcomes? And, you know, how did they get to that? Where did they get that from? Did they just pull it from the air? And I'd say, no, OMH doesn't do that. They're more serious about, we can just pull things here, pull things there. So they've gotten that answer from data. So a lot of this conversation today, we're going to keep jumping back to the source, and the data could be qualitative, it could be quantitative, it could be observation from others. Because those 3 key points, they help us to identify the disparities in outcomes. Where did this New York State OMH data come from? I'm not sure. The data came from the input submitted to New York State from organizations like yours. It comes from participant data. It's not something that they pulled from a book or pulled from a research. It is data that's reflective of you and I, reflective of our services, reflective of our clients. So when OMH says there are disparities in outcome, they're not making it up. They have something to back it up. And because of that, I think it's one of the key reasons why they want to address this, because as we go further into our presentation, you'll see some of the disadvantages and the negativity around disparities. OMH has this data portal, Psyches, where it collects and administers the data and documents a lot of what's going on with our clients, with our participants, with our members. I don't think, and you know, somebody's on the call, I don't think staff data is in there. I think it's just client, Medicaid and client related data that's there. And why is it so important to be looking on this data? It supports quality improvement, quality measures, and it gives us a way to flag certain things that's happening so that we can improve what we're doing. And I know that that data, it's not locked away in some vault. I know it's very accessible to all of us. And if I am kind of wrong in that, then somebody can kind of let me know. But I know that it's very accessible. And I think last year, OMH added a whole series of looking through this data, looking on this data through racial equity lens. So I know based on what used to happen and what happened recently, and I think last year was when it was rolled out, where people now have access to looking on some reports that pretty much captures a lot of what we'll be sharing with you today.
Lenora, may I interrupt you for just one moment?
Yes, please do.
I would love to give today's first keyword.
I did.
Well, I think, I'm not sure if people got you, because so Lenora said purple donkey earlier.
Yes.
She was trying to be sly, but the first keyword is just purple.
It's
so
purple.
I didn't want to confuse others. So I just wanted to interject and make sure everybody got the first keyword.
Thank you, Daniel.
Purple.
I thought I had to be sly.
Except the evaluation doesn't say donkey, it just says purple. So I didn't want to confuse everybody.
What's confused is the donkey or the purple. So guys, our first keyword is purple. Purple, purple, purple. So what does the PsyKeys data tell us? It tells us it collects some data, what we call data elements. And those are stuff that you put in there. Those are stuff that OMH is asking us to report on. It tells who participates in services, and it gives us an opportunity to analyze that data to then come up with the outcomes. So if you look at it, I know I mentioned a little earlier about the Medicaid stuff. We get the New York State Operated Psychiatric Center data on that. We get some Department of Health. We get some AOT. We're tracking incidents. There's a lot of stuff, and I don't know how much is readily available to folks, but I just went on the OMH website and I got this information. It's no secret. It's there, but it's information that I'd love for you to begin to tap into, to begin to use to help to improve what you guys improve the services that you so deliver and improve the outcomes that our participants need. We want positive outcomes for all. So Marie, you're on.
All right. So as we continue with this conversation surrounding disparities, right, there's a lot of definitions surrounding the notion of disparities, and it's kind of ongoing, right? We recognize that this process is definitely not linear. And of course, with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, ongoing incidents of police brutality, recent increase and rise of Asian hate crimes, lack of accessibility for communities that are differently abled, all of those occurrences have brought this highlight and this intense view on healthcare disparities overall, right, into the sharper focus within media and the public eye. However, it's really important when we continue this conversation, noting disparities, right, is recognizing that this conversation is not new, right? There have been many documents of disparities within specifically communities of color and structural racism for generations, for quite some time, okay? And so when we're discussing disparities, it's important for us to recognize that we're talking about these healthcare differences between groups of individuals that stem from broader inequities, okay? So it's stemming from so many different spaces. When we're talking about broader inequities, it can be associated with systemic issues that include race and ethnicity, gender, ability, disability, religion, or all of the above, especially when we're thinking about intersections, right? So again, as today we engage in this conversation and we're exploring the why, we looked at why we're engaging in these conversations, what the data is telling us. We also want to recognize how, right? How do we show up as service providers And how are we consciously or unconsciously perpetuating the desperate outcomes that we see specifically within marginalized communities and communities of color. So as we begin and get a little bit further into this conversation, it's important for us to also recognize some other definitions related to health disparities. So we started our conversation with health disparities being those between groups of individuals that stem from broader inequalities, right? Race, ethnicity, gender identity, all of those things, right? But when we look at other definitions, some really wonderful things start to show up. So when we're looking at the specific definition in green specifically, right? We see Healthy People 2030 defines health disparity as a particular type of health difference that is closely linked with socioeconomic and environmental disadvantages. But as you go even further from that, I love this definition because it starts to pull out other communities that are impacted, right? We have systemically experienced greater obstacles to health-based racial or ethnic groups, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, age, physical ability, all of these things in this green box really tell us about the communities that we're working with, right? And another really great definition, another really great resource as we're continuing this conversation is the definition provided by the CDC, right? Preventable differences in the burden of disease, injury, violence, or opportunities to achieve optimal health that are experienced by socially disadvantaged populations. And I'm going to pause really quickly, just for a couple seconds, because I think the CDC highlights something really important that's missing from a lot of these definitions, right? The very beginning of the CDC's definition emphasizes preventable differences, right? It's preventable differences. So we have this accountability and this power to start eliciting change within the services we're providing. And starting at the definition, starting at these foundations is really imperative, especially when we're talking about disparities, because as providers or as organizations, we want to evaluate, how are we defining disparity? How are we defining equity? How are we defining access, right? By looking at those definitions, we start to recognize where there might be holes in our definition, where we might not be identifying all of those individuals who are experiencing different historical discrimination or exclusion, right? Maybe there's bias that's creeping into these definitions as well, right? Again, we want to start to slow down and say, how are we talking about disparities within ourselves and as a greater community as well? Okay, and so by identifying those holes, we also start to recognize how we might be consciously or unconsciously perpetuating some of these disparities that exist. And it typically exists at this level when we're only defining disparities through one racial lens, through one gendered lens, through one able-bodied perspective. We start to recognize these holes within the care we're providing. Okay, and so again, just kind of recognizing that there are many different definitions of disparities, and we have various working definitions of this. And I loved that at the beginning of this session, Daniela mentioned that if you're watching this a year from now, those definitions might look a little bit different, right? So we want to be intentional about the work and say, by being intentional, that means I need to do the research consistently. I need to have spaces for these conversations consistently as well, okay? So as we continue to dive into the conversation, I want to take another moment to really emphasize this conversation surrounding disparities, okay? We have to recognize that disparities are deeply rooted within systems of oppression and systems of racism, okay? We cannot have the conversation surrounding health disparities without paying attention to the racism that exists within the systems in all of the spaces that we're existing, right? So as we notice within this slide, and this is one of my favorite slides because I think KFF does a really wonderful job in recognizing that racism and discrimination are existing in all of these spaces. So we can look at economic stability, the neighborhood and physical environment, education, food, community, healthcare systems, right? If we're looking at neighborhood and physical environment, are we also recognizing within the conversation of disparities that maybe we don't necessarily recognize that the Fair Housing Act wasn't signed until 1968, right? Limiting access for Black and Brown communities to be accepted for loans, to build equity within their communities, right? So even that notion alone lets us know that we're perpetuating different disparities for communities of color. right? When we look at community and safety and social context, are we also paying attention to the longitudinal effects of redlining within communities of color, right? When we're talking about food security and access to healthy options, how many communities are we serving that have access to healthy food options, that have grocery stores within their home environments, right? When we're looking at healthcare, are we talking about those mortality rates that exist for Black women at higher rates during childbearing years than those of their white counterparts? These are the conversations that exist within these notions of disparities. And when we want to reach that space where we see at the bottom of health and well-being, we have to recognize that the disparities are existing, and then also recognize how race and racism bleeds into these systems that we're trying to work through, right? So we have to acknowledge the policies. We have to acknowledge the procedures if we want to get to that space of equity surrounding healthcare, okay? So again, as we continue to have this conversation, it's also important for us to note what these disparities look like for communities of color, right? What other conversations are we not having surrounding mental health and substance use disorders by race and ethnicity, okay? So it's worth noting that rates of death by suicide are rising amongst individuals of color in comparison to their white counterparts. It's very important for us to recognize the rise in death associated with drug overdose, and it is a proportionally higher rate for people of color, right? Overall rates of mental illness and substance use are lower for people of color compared to white people, but may be underdiagnosed amongst people of color. And I want us to hold on to that little nugget right there, may be underdiagnosed amongst people of color. We'll come back to that here in a few minutes. And it's really important for us to continue to think about this. And when we're thinking about these key findings specifically, I want us to stop and think to ourselves, what are we doing within our practices? What are we doing on an intrapersonal level? What does it mean to have access to adequate and accessible services? What does it mean to have access to culturally competent service providers? What does it mean to have access to providers with resources to communities that look like me, that talk like me, that think like me, right? Is that part of the conversation when we're thinking about disparities overall? All right, so when we're thinking about these key findings, when we're seeing the statistics here, we're recognizing that maybe that lack of representation, that lack of cultural competency, the lack of having these conversations within healthcare communities specifically has a long-term impact on communities of color and those communities that have been marginalized over time as well, okay? So
thank you so much, Marie. That was a nice lead into this slide. I love the slide. It's so pretty. Kathy came up with this. Kathy does a lot of work on these things, and I want to acknowledge all the work that she puts into it. And if you think of the slide with what I'm calling the blue slide that Marie spoke to earlier from the Kaiser Permanente group, it's kind of capturing some of the same things, but in a different picture. And what the slide highlights with social determinants of health right in the middle. And I'm sure most of us, if not all, we keep hearing this word. It's become very popular over the last 5 years or so that people are beginning now to identify, or more than 5 years, and pull it out and speak to it. We have a lot of organizations that actually that's all they focus on. Some of the social determinants of health, like housing, like transportation, a lot of those organizations are funded just to do that. So what are these determinants of health? There are factors in the environment where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age. So that covers everything about us. Is where we go to, we worship, where we play, where we go to school, where we do. And if you go back, just think about what Marie spoke about earlier. It's looking on all those things that actually impact our well-being. While very often our overall health and well-being is affected by access to good health care. And I'm going to qualify that by saying the access that we get when we go to the doctor's office. Like when we go for, when I go see my therapist, when I go see my primary care doctor, that while very often we think that's it. I'm going to put out there to you today, and it's out there, it's not just my thinking, that our health and well-being are also affected by our homes, our access to fresh fruits and vegetables, the quality of the air we breathe, our education systems, where we work, where we worship, our jobs. We look on the stresses and the pressures in our schools, our jobs, our neighborhoods. In fact, these factors can and often do impact our health and well-being more than the access that we get when we go to see our psychiatrists or therapists or doctors. They affect our functioning and our overall quality of health. This is a diagram, a picture that we borrowed from someplace. And they have many different, it comes in many different, people have it depicted in many different ways. But the essence of it, if you look on the lower, that blue 20%, it is saying that is what we experience. That's how much our health outcome is dependent on the going to the doctor or being in the doctor's office. 20% of our outcome is dependent on that. 30% is on our own behaviors. 10% is on our physical environment, and 40% of our outcome can be related to our socioeconomic factors. So this is sharing with you what Marie spoke about in that blue diagram. It's given us a little bit, it hits a little hard for me when I first, years ago, when I thought of this and I kept reading and seeing some of the research as in that only about 20 to 30% of our outcome is actually aligning with when I go to the doctor. I had to pause. And then I begin to think about, if that is it, then does my doctor has a responsibility to help me to achieve my other 70%? And I'm going to put out there to you that yes, we do. And that's some of the reasons why we're doing this. We're doing this work because we realize that over and above that 20-30%, there's so much more out there that impacts our health, impacts our outcome, and we have some responsibility to it. Marie speak about being accountable and being accountable to the outcome of those we serve. And really, it is one of the things that we have to pay a lot of attention to. Mm-hmm. So Marie hinted at that health disparities are driven by racism. And we will you'll hear some more about that as we move further into our conversation today. Racism is, it's a system, it really is. And it consists of structures, it consists of policies, it consists of practices and norms. All these things come together. So when we talk about addressing racism, we're addressing disparities, we got to look on it all. Because by just addressing one piece, we never quite get the outcomes that we want. This results in conditions that unfairly advantage some and disadvantage others throughout our society. It's both interpersonal and it's structural. It negatively affects the mental and physical health of a lot of individuals, millions and millions of people, preventing us, and I put myself in there, I just put myself in there because I'm impacted by it, preventing us from attaining highest level of health and consequently affecting the health of our state. There's a growing body of research that shows that centuries of racism in this country, in our state, has had a profound and negative impact on communities of color. The impact is pervasive and deeply embedded in our society. And I want us to take that a little further, affecting where one lives, how one learns, where one works, going back to the social determinants of health. And that's the kind of overlay that I want us to be thinking about as we go through our conversation today. So it impacts, it's pervasive, and it impacts where we live, learn, work, worship, play, creating inequities in access to a range of social and economic benefits. So when we say disparities are driven by racism, this is what we're talking about. And the data shows that racial and ethnic minority groups experience higher rates of illness and death across a wide range of health conditions. Some we're very familiar with, and a lot of our white counterparts, compared to our white counterparts. Additionally, life expectancy of non-Hispanic Blacks is 4 years lower than that of our white counterparts. COVID, like Marie mentioned earlier, it kind of brought it to the forefront, because I think when we started looking on the data coming out of COVID, kind of realized on who was impacted, who were dying more and at what rates. And it gave us pause to begin to say, oh my God, where did this come from? But it also afforded us an opportunity to be more deliberate about addressing it and putting things in place from a systemic, institutional, individual level, because we all have a part to play to ensure that we reduce the things that impact disparities and impact the outcomes of our clients. So what are some of the broader implications? It's a need to recognize, and I'll just read that one last thing. There's a need to recognize and address racism as a root cause of disparities. You can move on, Marie.
Thank you, Ms. Lenora. And really quickly too, I know that we've been saying a lot of colors for some reason today in our session. So the next keyword is indeed blue. So very clear for all of us, it is blue is our next keyword. So thank you for bearing with us with that one. And then we also, which is I think a perfect time to address some of the questions that have been coming in throughout the session. There was a question talking about disparities if a person is in more than one group, right? If we have some intersecting identities, if somebody is Black and trans, right? They might have different experiences based on those various identities. And that's something that we're going to jump into this conversation, because the answer is most definitely yes, right? Somebody's going to have different experiences based on being part of different marginalized groups, right? And it's important for us, as we are talking about race, a lot about race and racism today, it's important to recognize, yes, that these systems that we're functioning in don't always recognize that core, right? That race or ethnicity that somebody is involved with. So when we're talking about this is part of the conversation of identifying and talking about those cultural attributes and those cultural identities of the person who's in front of you, right? Or the people that are in front of you. Are we having conversations? Are you aware of the organization's cultural mix of staff and of participants, right? Are we engaging in those conversations? How do the participants define the individuals they work with, both as participants and staff, right? Again, thinking about all these attributes and all of these identities, how often are we intentionally going into conversations with these things in mind in relation to disparities that exist within these communities? Okay, so again, just keeping that in mind. So yes to that question that came up into the chat, and also thinking about at an organizational level, what does that look like as well? Okay, so as we lean into when we're thinking about these cultural attributes and identities, we want to pay attention to the community that we're serving, right? Who are we serving as a community? I know when we asked the why at the very beginning of the session, many people came in and said, we need to know how to engage with the people that we're serving. And so at some level, we know that and we recognize that, but sometimes we get stuck in that first box, right? Race, ethnicity, age, social orientation, religion, spiritual practices, right? We also need to think about these other areas as well, right? Are we thinking about migrant status, immigrant status, refugee status, employment status? When we're encouraging individuals within our sessions, hey, we're going to give you some homework to continue to work on your goals. Are we giving them homework that aligns with their needs? Are we thinking about literacy levels? If I gave somebody homework, is that going to make sense for them, right? My previous work engaged with deaf and hard of hearing individuals, okay? If I'm giving written work, some individuals might prefer something more visual. That's something that I have to know back here, and also I have to ask. I have to engage in that conversation with the person in front of me. I was thinking about the podcast that Lenora, myself, and Dr. Kelly just recently recorded. It was a space, and I'm so excited for you all to listen to it, but it was a space with 3 Black women, right? I think at a societal level, we might say, we've got 3 Black women in a space, they all need the same resources. Each one of us are different. Each one of us are coming to the table with different experiences, different identities. Just because we're Black doesn't mean we're all this label of African American, right? I know my Miss Lenora here necessarily doesn't maybe identify with it, right? Being from Jamaica. How does that experience change the care that we're providing? And so if we're coming with this blanket of approach to the provision of care, we're going to have a lot of holes into the work. And that's part of that process of becoming culturally competent and recognizing that the system doesn't always make sense for everybody who's existing within that system. So we might have to get a little bit more creative.
And
then
Mary, if I just
Yes.
want to interject a little,
Please.
because one of the things why it's so important, this, let's not make it about us. Let's make it when we're providing the services. Let's make it about our colleagues. Let's make it about our clients. And when you listen to the podcast, one of the things that came up is sexual orientation and being gay. And, it's one of those things, delicate, but we addressed it because it needed to be addressed. And, it was so, I think the way it was addressed was so nicely done. We can't be talking at a university level, a master's level, when we're treating our clients who are at a grade 3 level. We're going to be talking over their heads. And so it's very important to understand who they are, what they bring to the table, so that when they are with us, they get what we want them to have to make their lives better. And they're not just nodding, yes, yes, yes. I use my mother, God bless her soul, just passed away. But very often I'd say, who is this I just met in the doctor's office? Because she was just nodding, going, oh, yeah. And when we got home, it was a whole different thing. I had to sit her down to then unravel what happened, because she felt while she was seeing the doctor, she had to behave in a certain way because the doctor had the power and she didn't.
Yes, those power dynamics. Thank you.
Yes.
Lenora, that's hugely important. And I see too within the chat, right? There's notes of, connotations regarding politics, right? I think what was so beautiful within the podcast specifically is we didn't stray away from that conversation of religion, right? We have these topics where we kind of avoid having these conversations, but if someone's religion, someone's political affiliation is very much part of their identity, if we don't have the conversation, we're doing them a disservice, right? We need to acknowledge our bias within that space and say, how is this coming into play? The same as you acknowledging, in a doctor's office, your mom might be taking on those different roles within those power dynamics, changing that narrative. And as we continue, we talk about trust. And a couple more slides going on, developing trust within that relationship of saying, you know what, doc, you're going right over my head. I need you to give this in a way that I'm understanding. And I'm not going to be comfortable saying that unless I trust the person who's providing care for me. So that's really, really hugely important. So as we continue really quickly, I want us to also think kind of back on our conversation that we just had surrounding some of those findings related to mental health and substance use disorder based on race and ethnicity, right? We also need to recognize the bias that's built into the systems that we're using every day, okay? And I know I've referenced this a couple of times already. I know Lenora has referenced it several times as well, but the majority of healthcare tools, screenings, and other devices have just not been designed to represent communities of color, right? Or other disproportionately marginalized communities. Standardized and widely accepted tools used to identify an array of different mental health diagnoses lack cultural sensitivity and awareness. Therefore, oftentimes individuals using those tools also are lacking that cultural awareness and fails to provide resources for the communities that are served. Okay, and so coupled with the structural barriers that we've been talking about and acts of institutional racism, we may contribute to that underdiagnosis of mental health illness amongst communities of color. Okay, and so that was something that we mentioned a little bit ago as well, but that underdiagnosis surrounding mental illness and mental disorders surrounding people of color is really important and imperative for us to take a moment and pause and reflect and see what areas we can really work to improve even having this conversation, right? This starts really early. Symptoms of mental health or mental illness and substance use disorders amongst people of color are likely to be labeled as disruptive or criminal compared to their white counterparts. Again, occurring in childhood, where behaviors that might be characterized as mental health concerns amongst white children are considered disruptive and are penalized amongst children of color. Okay, and so this might start this process of underreporting of mental health issues amongst communities of color, whether it's the child, the parent, or the guardian, right? We're not having this structure of trust. We're not having a space where I can report something that I'm seeing or I'm experiencing without it being labeled as something disruptive, right? Disruptive to the classroom, where it's being labeled differently for our white counterparts, okay? And so the process of eliminating such racial disparities begins with instilling this idea and these concepts surrounding racial equity into the work that we're collectively doing. So when we're talking about racial equity, we're talking about this intentional and continual practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures by prioritizing these measurable changes in the lives of people of color. Okay, and with that, we also want to collectively reach that state of health equity, right, where everyone has a fair and just opportunity to attain their highest level of health. And when I'm thinking about health equity, I always pause because I see language of health equity on websites, on mission statements, on vision statements, and we often use that word without actually regarding and paying attention to what it means, right? Everyone has fair and just opportunities to attain their highest level of health. If we don't have racial equity built into the system, we cannot reach that level of health equity because we're not giving that opportunity for everyone on how they identify to have that highest level of health. Okay, so when we're thinking about creating these spaces where with a diverse behavioral workforce, culturally sensitive screening tools, culturally competent care, right? We want to be able to try to find ways to reduce those barriers and improve the quality of care and address those barriers that exist for people of color and other marginalized communities that have happened for generations. Okay,
And
so
if I just interject you a little bit, Marie, if you guys notice that we may be similar on racial equity because at the center of it all, race is huge, and you know that. But if you go back to that blue slide and the social determinants of health slide, we want to make sure that all the nuances that we captured, that there's space in your service environment for your colleagues and your clients, that there's space to address them. That if we think of rural, there are disparities based on folks who live in rural New York. There are many other things. Geography, it does has a big impact on the outcomes of individuals. Do they have the transportation? Do they have the language? Do they have when we think of somewhere like a New York City compared to a North Country, even compared to a Rochester, what are the things that we need to be paying particular attention to for that region? Because a lot of times it's very different. That's why it's so important to know your community, know who you're serving, know where folks are coming from. And the census gives us a lot of that information. You can go online and type in for your area, get the census information, and it gives you a clear listing of what are the cultural nuances in your areas where you live and where your clients are coming from. So I want you to think about that. And then one things that you begin to overlay race and those things on top of some of that. We think of language, we think of this, you think of housing, you think of transportation. And once you begin to overlay ethnicity and race on top, then somebody asked, and Marie addressed it, are the disparities different? And they can be once you begin to put layers and layers and layers on top of the data.
Yes, that's a wonderful point, Lenora. Thank you for adding it. And I think it just emphasizes the importance of this work, of course, but also the challenges, right? There are
Yes.
so many different layers. It's like an onion, right? We'll Shrek
Mhm.
folks here, right? We have to start to peel back those layers and we start to realize that they're connected in some way, shape, or form. So I think that's really important. And as we continue this conversation and some things that, again, is great to see in the chat, because we've already kind of referenced a lot of this, right? Is it's a person when we're having these conversations, we also want to recognize it's a personal choice to self-identify with certain expressions or concepts. I know within the podcast, again, we'll have the opportunity to discuss that here shortly, as well as there was an opportunity for us to self-identify, right? In the ways that make sense for us. And I think that's a wonderful thing to continue to incorporate within the work we're doing. We also want to remember a diagnosis of a disability should never define a purpose or a person. Again, something we're going to explore here shortly. As a review, we all have unique social contexts, personalities, goals, aspirations, and relationships with others. We all have our own story, right? We're all coming with our own narrative, and it's my opportunity to be able to tell you my story after I develop this trusting relationship. I'm telling you my story, and you have the opportunity to believe what I tell you, right? We need to be aware of how individuals want to be identified. To know, we must ask, and that's part of that process of asking, being uncomfortable with the uncomfortable, right? A lot of us aren't always comfortable asking those questions. That's a really, really huge and imperative step when we're developing relationships with the communities that we're serving. And of course, our job is then to make those modifications and adaptations to the approaches, right? How we communicate, how we need to ensure successful outcomes exist. Okay, so making those adaptations are also part of this process of being comfortable with the uncomfortable. A lot of the systems and the tools that we use within our work every day don't always allow for that flexibility, right? So if there's a policy or procedure in place that isn't allowing this flexibility or adaptations to be made, that's another area where organizationally we can have a conversation. This is not including the individuals who are differently able. This isn't including individuals who are blind or visually impaired or deaf and hard of hearing or differently abled in different ways. How do we create space to make those adaptations that make sense, again, with the communities that we're serving? Okay. So really quickly, because I know time is always getting the better of us, but I want to quickly reference some of the previous presentation that we had with Dr. Farkas, and it was really, really wonderful. And there was a lot of really, really imperative things that I think go into this conversation surrounding health equity and these conversations surrounding disparities in health overall, right? Our goal is to overlay some of the cultural attributes and identities to get us to a place to find those equitable outcomes for the communities that we're serving. So a little bit of a summary for those of us who weren't able to attend the previous conversation is these conversations about seeing the person and not the disability, right? We'll touch on all of these again as we move forward. Developing a trusting partnership. We've echoed this over and over and over again, and developing a trusting relationship is going to look different for everybody. And that's why we have to be intentional about having these conversations. We want to support the person to figure out what role they want, right? Not the role that I think that they should have, what their goals are, not the goals that I think an individual should have, right? Regarding the environment that they're existing in, whether it's in their learning environment, educational environment, where they want to socialize, right? We want to support the person in developing and carrying out a plan to use the skills and resources that they already have. I cannot emphasize this one over and over again, right? When we're talking about healthcare facilities, right? When we're thinking about those disparities or social determinants of health, and we're telling our community members, you know, you need to eat green leafy vegetables. You need to go to the grocery store, get those green leafy vegetables because it's going to make you feel better. Well, I don't have transportation to get to the grocery store, right? I don't have access to those things. What resources do I have available to me? How can we make that more attainable? Okay. How can we continue that conversation to find ways that make sense for us? Okay. So again, just really quickly, looking at the review from the previous conversation, seeing the person, their talents, their interests, the skills, not a label or the disability. And that's something that I think we quickly get kind of sucked into based on the way that we function in our workplaces, right? We often talk about the individual as a label rather than how they identify, right? Who the person is, okay? Other things that we also want to think about is the support the person to figure out what role they want within their spaces, We just had a wonderful conversation about religion and spirituality, right? How does an individual want to show up in their religious environment, in a social environment? It might look different in an education environment, in a home versus outside their home. So these are things that we want to think about when we're providing care and we're having these conversations about health equity overall. And so really quickly, we are going to jump into our first little activity for you all to hopefully get some engagement. I'm going to Kathy is already on top of it, and Kathy's already put the link in the chat. So thank you so much. As a collective, we're going to answer the question, how do you want to be seen? Okay. How do you want to be seen as an employee and in a call or as a colleague? And how do you want to be seen as an individual receiving healthcare services? So if you can just jump on and click the link that Kathy has added into the chat, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Kathy is actually going to pull up our Slido account so we can see a little bit of a word cloud of what we're all thinking. All right, Kathy, you should be all set. Oh, I like this, right? We've got reliable, respected, human. I like that one. Want to be seen as human, valued and respected. Mom, in the chat, we've got empathetic. These are great.
And look how different and similar they are, because you see something like enlightened. You know, I doubt someone is going to be, when you're asked those questions, how do you want to be seen? I would not be thinking of enlightened, but just think about the additional information you get from that individual when they share they want to be seen as enlightened. That's huge. And how do you respond to that as an individual? That's, you know, that's huge.
Yes. And even in the chat, we're getting some, right? Compassionate, supportive, valuable.
Supportive. I like supportive too. A valuable contributor. Very often a lot of us aren't seen as that, and we're kind of overlooked or overstepped, and people don't see us for what we bring to the table.
Yes. And often we don't ask these questions to one another very often, right? And even for me, thinking about it, right? I'm not thinking about all these terms, but I have a different story in my mind. This is great.
Oh, I love this little Slido thing.
Yes. Who I am. Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much.
Important. I love important. Oh, the great responses, guys.
Worthwhile, able. Yes.
Caring, empathetic. You know, we talk a lot about empathy.
And I see Sam had mentioned in the chat as well. It's interesting that people have traits, and it's not necessarily about race, religion, gender, identity.
Yes.
Right? We're here as people. That's great.
Yes. And that's exactly what we were trying to get at when we put this exercise together.
Yes.
That there's so much more about us than meets the eye. There's a lot about us that we want those who we work with and those who provide services to us to understand and to see us in all our glory.
Yes. And I want to just call out Patricia's in the chat as well. Funny as hell. I like it.
I love it.
That's part of you, and I like it.
That's nice.
Perfect.
I like that I matter, because sometimes one of the challenges that we have that people don't see us.
Yes.
They don't see us as human beings. They don't see us as individuals. And I would love people to know that I matter. Please see me. This is who I am. See me and respond to me. And the same thing, our clients are saying the same thing. They may not and may have some of the same words we're using, but I'll guarantee you that our clients would use several of these words to describe how they want to be seen as an individual.
Yes. No, that's great. Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing your screen. And as we're wrapping up our first Slido, we'll have a couple more here coming up. I just want to, before I share my screen again, one of the ones also in the chat that kind of stood out to me was from Anthony, able to change my mind. I think
oh,
that's
yes.
really powerful,
oh, my gosh.
too, right?
That one is so important because, like, you know, very often when we ask folks to identify themselves, and we'll say, well, I'm a mother, I'm a Black woman, and we tend to lock them in that space, not giving them the opportunity to change who they are. And we're human beings. I change who I am from I walk through the front door till I get to my desk. I'm somebody else or something else, but I want you to see me in all of who I am and how I am identifying myself in that space at that time.
Definitely. No, that was great. Thank you all for engaging in our first Slido activity. It's great that it worked well for us. And I
It's
think
great that it worked.
It worked. I know. It's a great way to see again how these different parts of us make up how we want to be seen, and also how it exists in different spaces, right? And again, how that can change from time to time. If we're watching this a year from now, are we going to put the same descriptors as we did this year, as we did last year, or 3-4 years ago during the pandemic? What would our language change within those spaces as well? So thank you. All right, Ms. Lenora, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, so how do we know if we are effective in our psych rehab service outcomes? How do you know, as somebody who is providing those services, that you are effective? What are going to be your measures? How are you going to be holding yourself accountable? What are you going to be looking on? And one of the things that we would like you to pay attention to is going back. We're going to keep going back to those slides, that blue slide, and begin to think about how we see individuals as we track the person. Like Dr. Marian Farkas speaks to tracking the person in their living, learning, working. Isn't that the same thing that we're saying? It's not very different. So we got to connect the dots. Look on all these trainings and connect the dots. We don't want to leave and says, okay, we went to a racial equity training with Lenora and Marie and Kathy, and then we went to something else with Dr. Farkas. No, they're all the same. We're talking about the same thing. And we wanted to connect the dots so you can begin to look on service outcomes as you track the individual through those eyes. And think of that slide or Slido. Think of all the things that came up, all the answers that we got. We want to be able to think about ways in which we can begin to feel accountable to how people are saying that they want to be identified. And as you track the person, what are some of the factors that can negatively impact or act as a barrier to our overall health and well-being? So we want you to think about that. What did we say? Put answers in the chat.
Yes.
As you begin to track the person in the how Dr. Farkas mentioned that we should be tracking, what are some of the things that could impact it negatively? And please identify if you consider these to be cultural barriers, because you're going to want to take a different look at what those barriers are and how you address those barriers.
We're getting some good ones already. We have current mood, season of the year, lack of transportation, and yes, right, related to some of those cultural nuances, unexpected life events, anniversaries, financial, yes, economic disparities, right? Lack
of housing options, which is huge. No health insurance, safety, childcare, that's huge. I remember when my daughter was young, it was one of the things I had to constantly be thinking about, childcare. How it's going to impact my job, me going to work, not going to work, what I do. It's huge. We cannot, and if we think of our clients who may not have some of the resources that we have, it's huge. We can't negate that. We cannot not address it. Oh, domestic violence is just like, it's huge is not even a strong enough word to think about how we address that.
Shyness is in here. Shyness could be cultural, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. And what we define as shyness may not be shyness in a cultural group.
Correct.
Because some of our cultural groups, you speak to the parent or to the husband, not to the person who is actually before you for services. And you may be seeing that person as shy when that person is really operating within their cultural norms. So it's
Yes.
understanding and knowing that and knowing how to address someone who is probably shy the way we define it, or shy based on the culture that they live in and they
Right.
operate in.
And even the operation within the dominant culture, right?
Oh,
We get
yes.
pulled into that very easily because again, it's that dominant culture. Thinking about ACEs, you know, adverse childhood experiences. Definitely. Safety. Definitely. Lots of good ones. Lots of good ones in here.
Lots of stuff to think about.
Yes.
And to incorporate that as you leave, things that you can say, oh my gosh, I didn't think about empathy. I didn't think about shyness.
Mm.
You know, there's someone at work who I think is shy and won't speak up, won't step up to the plate. I may be able to address that person differently, because now it's in the forefront of my mind and I'm realizing it may be one of those things that's a barrier that is impeding that person's progress, and I can do something about it.
Yes.
Because that's the whole idea, right? That you come to these things and we want to leave with at least 1 or 2 gems that you can say when you go back to your space, your workspace, and say, oh my gosh, let me address that. It's something I can address immediately, or I can put it in my toolbox and pull it out when it's appropriate.
Yes.
So our behavioral health and well-being are influenced by many factors, both within our control and beyond it. And very often, social factors are very crucial, and we've gone over some of them. And here's some more we're gonna, some may be what we're repeating, but we want to bring them to your attention again. Poverty, not having enough income to provide for necessities, but also what's our source of income? That, you know, very often we think about not having enough income, but what is the source of income when we do have income? Inequality, disparity and inequalities between different groups, among groups, social isolation and loneliness, that's huge. And that came to light during COVID, that folks, as excited as some of us were to stay home and out of the office, loneliness became one of those things in isolation that kind of hit us slap, slap, slap across our faces. And we had to deal with it. For some of my friends, that was the first time for them that they begin to acknowledge that there's a mental health challenge. There's a drinking, there's something that they have to think about. How do they traverse the fact of being alone for hours, or being home with spouses and children that never usually impact them when they go to the office. Low levels of education, that's huge. Rapid social change. And that's just just like, you get up today, it's something, tomorrow is something else, it's another thing, and it's just coming at you like rapidly. And nobody asks us, nobody's pausing and giving you time to, okay, I need to address this. It's like we have to be quick and responsive. And some of us aren't that quick and responsive. Mm-hmm. So we got to give space for those who aren't, and what needs to happen in those spaces. We have factors like emergencies. People often face difficult situations which can negatively impact them and have long-lasting effects. An emergency for someone is not necessarily an emergency for others. So you got to really you got to strip away the layers and say, okay, what's this emergency? What does it mean to you, and how can I help you? Stressful work conditions. Let me tell you, that one is huge. Mm-hmm. That is huge. And very often, I think we kind of just ignore it, and we tell, oh, you're professional, put on your big girl underwear, pull your boots up and go with it, without acknowledging that a lot of times, apart from just impacting our outcomes in the office, it really does cripple us in terms of how we behave, what we take home with us, and how do we get out of, what do we need to do to get out of those stressful work situation. Discrimination and other human rights violation, violence and abuse, physical health conditions, inexistent or inadequate services or support. I mean, these worsen the problems that we have. And that's why we cannot see someone when we're engaging with someone, either your colleague or your client who has a mental health challenge or experiencing some substance use challenge. We cannot we can't just address one little piece of who they are. We need to look on the whole person. And like Marie says earlier, we really got to begin to ask them to help us. To know them, assuming who they are is a big disgrace for us and the field. We need to ask them who they are so that they can literally begin to share with us. This is who I am, like that Slido. This is how I want to be recognized. This is what's happening to me today.
Mhm.
We can go to our next slide. So as we go through, we're coming to the end of our stuff. We still have a few minutes and we're going to milk it for what all it is. I want you to begin to think about, as we have the conversations today, do you think some of the changes discussed could be implemented in the service you know? Would it be difficult? What would stop you from doing so? As we talk about overlaying, looking on the whole person, social determinants of health, overlaying the race, ethnicity, gender on those things, would that be difficult? And what would be some of the stuff that would stop you from identifying? And dear, we did not say the next word is pink, not pink donkey or pink horse. Pink. Pink is the next word. So we had purple, we had blue, and now we have pink.
We're getting some of those answers in. I know this was going to take a little bit more thought as we're typing these in, right? I know Anthony mentioned we have a very open culture where I work and can discuss these things often. That's wonderful. Antoinette is mentioning that these changes are a big part of the work that are currently being done.
Personal work and professional work. That's good. We got to work on all of it.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it, when we have these conversations, a lot of it is personal, right?
I honestly, I agree with you, Mary. I think a lot of it is personal.
Yeah.
We got to first identify ourselves, our own challenges, our own faults, the good, the bad, and the ugly, deal with it so we can then deal with others.
And just responding, yes, the third word is pink.
Yes, it's pink.
Keeping the discussion going can help with implementation, most definitely. Getting buy-in from leadership, right? When Elizabeth mentions the ability to sit with your discomfort, right? And I think, again, that goes from that personal level, but even as groups within an organization, when we're being accountable, are we sitting with that discomfort of, oh, that policy definitely is rooted in bias and discrimination, or not necessarily thinking about that equitable lens.
Yeah, and I know some of this topic kind of gets us a little uncomfortable sometimes. So the person who wrote, just being able to be comfortably in at uncomfortable space is huge. Because it's not an easy thing to talk about, it's not an easy thing to address. And it brings us a level of discomfort, and we just have to, find how do we find a way to roll with it. It's going to be very important.
Definitely. And I'm seeing within these comments too, it seems like a lot of spaces are having these conversations, but also recognizing that it's ongoing, right? It's not linear.
It isn't. And sometimes we have to take steps back and go sideways and turn around and jump up and down and do the dance. It is not, and that's why it's so challenging. It isn't step 1, step 2, step 3. It may be step 1, step 2, and then go back -10. And to be able to grapple with, and going back to what Daniela said earlier, things change as new information comes to the field. As we learn more, we begin to sharpen our approaches, we begin to modify and make adaptations to our approaches, because Marie mentioned this earlier about myself. I came to the United States close to 40 years, and I'll tell the person I am now, it's very different than who. So you could not treat the same Lenora 40 years ago and treat that same person in the same way. it changes.
Yep.
As we
Mm.
assimilate, it makes a huge difference.
Definitely.
Do we want to go to our next Slido? I love the Slido thing.
I like the Slido. Let's jump into our Slido. Okay.
Yeah, I love it.
Let's jump into another activity. Okay. So
Yeah.
how can service providers utilize PSR within the context of racial equity? Okay, and when we're talking about PSR, it's referencing the previous session that we had talking about psychosocial rehabilitation programs, right? It is a therapeutic treatment modality that provides rehabilitation for behavioral disorders, and the program is designed to provide intervention for people to improve behavioral skills related to barriers affecting how they integrate into society. So again, I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quickly. Kathy's going to pull up the Slido for us and we can see what answers we have coming up on the screen. All right, Kathy, it's all yours. And I will also put the definition of PSR in the chat for all of us who might have been unable to.
Oh, these guys, you're on the roll.
Yeah, they got it. They don't even need me.
Dr. Farkas will also be very pleased.
Yes. I love that person-centered is our big one in the middle there.
Yes, yes, yes.
Trauma-informed.
Recognize your own biases.
Yes.
That's a huge one.
Self-identification of goals. I love that one. I think that's another area where we sometimes get lost of, we have this list of goals that we know are effective, but we're not necessarily, doing that person-centered work. No judgment.
And person-centered doesn't mean here are 3 goals, select one. Correct. I know you guys know that, but I just had to say it. Because sometimes that's how I hear it. Here are 3 goals, select one.
Resources, and I know that we might have not had the opportunity to talk about too much of resources, but resources that aren't, the run of the mill that we usually talk about. I know a lot of the conversation as of recently has been even resources surrounding healing circles, right? That's a resource that's really beneficial for communities, especially, communities of color, marginalized communities.
Yeah, we're going to be doing some healing circles. As a matter of fact, one is happening in Rochester today because recently at a concert that I think a gunshot, I wasn't here, but from the little I hear, several people got hurt and was mostly people of color. So we're doing some healing circles in Rochester as a community to help to address some of the trauma that folks experienced at that concert.
Right. I'm glad those resources are available.
Yes, yes.
We got a very kind reminder from Daniela. We've got 5 minutes left. So,
oh my Jesus, jump to the next slide.
We'll jump to the next slide, Kathy, if you don't mind. We'll have you stop sharing and I'll jump in really quick. Let's see. All right. So really quickly as we wrap up, just thinking about trauma as well, thinking about using that trauma-informed, racially equitable lens. Trauma has been part of the conversation. It's been throughout the chat as well. I also just kind of want to reference, I know we don't necessarily have time to discuss it, when we're thinking about trauma, especially related to communities of color, there are 6 different types of racism-related stress that it would be really great for all of us to continue to explore that exist. It's racism-related life events, vicarious racial experiences, daily racism, chronic contextual stress, collective experiences, transgenerational transmission. All of these experiences impact that trauma for the communities that we're serving, okay? And we also want to, as service providers, we want to find ways that we avoid re-traumatizing the individuals that we serve, and then, of course, paying attention to those services and refrain from the practices that encourage violence or coercion amongst those communities. Okay.
Marie, do you have a resource that we could share on the website that highlights all those, I think we should share. If we haven't sent that to Daniela, we need to.
Most definitely. I will most definitely include that within those resources. And
Yeah.
we'll just skip along here. I'm gonna skip this last chat because I think we're all kind of on the same page, which has been wonderful. And also a lot of the things that we've already touched. So I'm gonna throw it to you, Lenora, so we have some opportunities for questions at the end of this.
Yeah, so one of the things that we would like homework, you have homework, is to, when you think of identities that you have identified earlier, please, we don't have the 5 minutes. So
Mhm.
after you leave, please take some time to think about that. What are some of these identities, especially the ones that are not so obvious? And we'd like you to write your own recovery plan based on the identities that you come up with for yourself. And we're hoping that when we have our time together, I think it's next week, when we have office hours, then that can be, we can have some conversations around that as well. And we have 2 minutes. If there are any questions that that you feel that we can do, but also bring them to the to when we have our time together, and we will definitely address them. Or what can be, you can also send them to Marie and myself ahead of time, and we can probably send some resources to you prior to the office hours.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you. And I know Daniela is possibly hopping on to talk about.
I am here.
Okay, perfect.
I was actually just typing in the chat. It may be easier if folks want to send questions. Oh, my camera shutter is closed. Sorry about that. We've been laughing about that a lot lately in our office. 3 years later, right? So if you would like to send questions ahead of time for the office hour, we'd love for you to do that. You can shoot them over to me, Daniela L
Yes.
at NIAPers. You
Yes.
can also use the website at the information email, or the questions, send questions. They all come to me, and we take care of all that throughout the week. So if you think of anything, please send that along. Hot off the presses, we just got the podcast, the edited podcast today. So it's actually already on the website and already posted. Please listen to the podcast. It is, I just can't stress how incredible I think it came out. It's like, and I say this, I feel like a broken record sometimes, but it literally feels like you're eavesdropping on a wonderful conversation. We're so lucky to have a provider from Western New York who works with us quite often, actually. And she was able to meet with Lenora and with Marie and sit down for about an hour, actually, and have this wonderful conversation, which really kind of takes the information we talked about today and brings it into the context of the work that they're doing at that organization and that this person is doing as the COO at the organization. So even if you're not in agency leadership, it's an important conversation to eavesdrop in. So I encourage you to do that via the podcast. You can listen to it through our website. We're also brand new as of today. We're on Spotify, folks. So you can listen to this podcast as well as the previous one if you haven't already on Spotify. And if you want to, I think that, yep, perfect. The next slide about the office hour, as Lenora just mentioned, please join us next week, Wednesday from 2 to 3. You'll have access to these wonderful people. Bring your questions. Think about how what you heard today really sort of intersects and overlaps, to use Lenora's word, overlaps with what you heard Dr. Farkas talk about, with the work that you're already doing. And we can get into some of the nitty gritty about it next week, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I think with that, if you don't see anything else, Marie, I know that you answered a few of the questions in the chat already. I'm going to comb through the chat box as well. Afterwards, we keep track of the chat, so we have it later, and we'll download it, and I'll go comb through it, and we'll pull out some questions and share those with you ahead of the office hour so that you have them.
Yeah. And there were only 3 words. 3 words: purple, blue, and pink.
Yep.
No donkeys.
We're gonna get the hang of this keyword thing by the end of this training academy. All right, folks. I want to say thank you to everyone that was listening in today. We appreciate you. We're glad that you're joining us. Thanks to those that are watching the recording. And of course, thank you to our partners and our friends at CCSI, Lenora, Marie, and Kathy in the background that no one could see, but was definitely helping out with the Slido and the slides in general, and our office staff as well. So we'll see you next week. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Marie.